My family thought they could protect their golden boy forever. But the moment my brother shoved my 8-year-old daughter to the ground and snarled that she was a spoiled brat just for reaching for a holiday cookie, something inside me snapped. I watched in absolute disbelief as my mother instantly jumped to his defense, smoothing it over with a dismissive, "He didn't mean it. It was just an accident." My dad didn't even look up from his plate, muttering, "Quit overreacting, it's Christmas." They expected me to swallow my pride, stay quiet, and keep the peace like I always did. They thought family ties meant absolute immunity. But as my crying daughter clung to my leg, I looked each of them dead in the eye and delivered a promise they never saw coming. See you in court. Follow my story until the end to see exactly how I dismantled their perfect illusion. My name is Sarah, and at 34 years old, I finally learned that the hardest bonds to break are the ones made of blood. To understand why I did what I did, you have to understand the toxic dynamic that ruled my family for decades. I was always the scapegoat, the independent one who was expected to look after herself, while my brother Julian was the undisputed golden boy. No matter what Julian did, no matter how irresponsible, reckless, or downright cruel he was, my parents completely coddled and protected him. They enabled his worst behaviors, constantly bailing him out of financial disasters and sweeping his toxic outbursts right under the rug. He grew up believing that the world owed him everything and that he could get away with absolutely anything because mom and dad would always be there to clean up his mess. For years, I stayed quiet just to keep the peace, swallowing my resentment for the sake of the family. But toxic enablement breeds monsters, and Julian had no boundaries left to cross. He honestly believed he was completely untouchable, and my parents' blind devotion only fueled his arrogance. Have you ever had to deal with an enabled golden sibling in your own family who gets away with everything while you take the blame? Drop a comment below and let me know, because what Julian did next changed our family dynamic forever. The dining room was filled with the warm scent of pine and roasted dinner, a picture-perfect holiday scene that was entirely fake. My 8-year-old daughter, Violet, who has always been a gentle, quiet child, was eagerly eyeing the dessert table. With a bright smile, she reached out her small hand to take a single holiday cookie from the edge of the platter. Before her fingers could even touch the frosting, Julian intercepted her. In a sudden flash of unprovoked anger, he didn't just swish her hand away. He aggressively shoved my little girl backward. Violet lost her footing on the slick hardwood floor and went down hard, her head narrowly missing the sharp edge of the sideboard. "Keep your hands to yourself, you spoiled brat," Julian snarled, his face twisted in disgust as he looked down at her crying on the floor. I rushed over, my heart hammering against my ribs as I pulled my sobbing daughter into my arms. I experienced an immediate wave of shock when the gaslighting began instantly. My mother didn't even stand up, casually waving her hand as she defended her golden boy. "Oh, Sarah, stop overreacting. He didn't mean it. It was completely accidental. He was just protecting the presentation of the table." My dad didn't even look up from carving the meat, muttering coldly, "Quit making a scene, it's Christmas. Leave it alone." As my daughter clung to my shirt, her small frame shaking with tears, a freezing clarity washed over me. I took Violet's hand, stood up straight, and looked my parents and brother dead in the eye. "See you in court," I said softly, my voice cutting through the festive room like ice. When I walked out of that house, my parents and Julian genuinely believed I was just throwing a dramatic temper tantrum. They assumed that once the holiday tension blew over, I would come crawling back, sweeping Julian's cruelty under the rug just like we always did. What they completely failed to realize, however, was that I possessed a massive legal lever they had entirely forgotten about. 3 years ago, when my parents were on the brink of losing their family business due to a terrible financial crisis, they begged me for help. Because Julian's credit was completely ruined by his reckless lifestyle, I was the only one who could step in. I agreed to co-sign the commercial property deeds and the master business contracts to keep them afloat, putting my own financial reputation on the line. In exchange, the legal structure of the contracts gave me a significant percentage of ownership and strict veto power over operational expenses. Over the last year, I had quietly noticed massive, unexplainable discrepancies in the company's digital ledgers, unauthorized wire transfers, mysterious consulting fees, and luxury personal expenses disguised as corporate deductions. I had been quietly compiling these documents for months, but out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty, I hadn't acted. But the second Julian laid his hands on my daughter, all loyalty evaporated. Julian hadn't just been mismanaging the company, he had been systematically embezzling corporate funds. I wasn't just suing him for what he did to Violet. I was preparing to legally seize everything. The reality of my move hit them exactly 4 days later, when the official legal notices were delivered directly to the business and my parents' doorstep. The smug confidence they had carried out of Christmas dinner vanished instantly, replaced by absolute panic. My phone became a war zone of non-stop notifications, buzzing relentlessly with a frantic barrage of guilt-tripping texts and manipulative voicemails. My mother was the first to try, calling me in floods of hysterical theatrical tears, begging me to reconsider. "Sarah, how can you do this to your own flesh and blood over a silly holiday misunderstanding? You will ruin your father's health." When the tears didn't work, my dad tried a tactic of cold, authoritarian anger, leaving a voicemail demanding that I grow up and drop the ridiculous lawsuit before the family name was permanently dragged through the mud. They even forced Julian to send a hollow, text-based apology that read like it was dictated by a terrified toddler, completely downplaying the shove as a total accident. But I blocked their numbers one by one. They weren't truly sorry for what Julian did to Violet. They were just terrified because the curtain was finally being pulled back on their golden boy's crimes. Every single flying saucer of fake remorse and emotional blackmail only hardened my resolve to see this through to the bitter end. They had spent decades sacrificing my well-being to protect a monster, but they were about to learn that I would gladly burn their entire kingdom to the ground to protect my child. The morning of the formal legal hearing arrived, and the air inside the courtroom felt heavy and sterile. Julian swaggered into the room wearing a tailored suit, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He sat down next to his high-priced attorney, looking completely unbothered, clearly expecting his legal team to easily sweep my accusations under the rug like our parents always did. My parents sat directly behind him in the gallery, shooting me icy, venomous glares that were meant to make me shrink back in guilt. They still truly believed I was just a bitter, overreacting scapegoat playing games. But the atmosphere in the room completely shifted the moment my attorney stood up and quietly spread our primary evidence across the table. First, he presented an itemized, airtight stack of forensic accounting records that exposed every single one of Julian's unauthorized wire transfers and fraudulent corporate expenses over the past 12 months. But the absolute final blow was something they never anticipated. My attorney pulled out a flash drive and hit play on the monitor, revealing a crystal-clear security video from a hidden nanny cam I had installed in my parents' dining room months ago. The footage played in absolute silence. There was no denying what happened. The video clearly captured Julian stalking across the room, deliberately and aggressively hurling his full weight into my 8-year-old daughter, and shouting insults while she cried on the floor. Julian's smug grin vanished instantly. I watched with immense satisfaction as his hotshot defense attorney turned completely pale, his hands visibly shaking as he stared down at the undeniable proof of both financial fraud and intentional misconduct. The judge didn't waste any time after reviewing the undeniable evidence, delivering a ruling that completely shattered my family's protected illusion. Julian was found fully liable for major financial fraud, and the court ordered immediate, mandatory financial restitution to the business accounts I co-signed. To prevent any further bleeding of corporate assets, the judge stripped my brother of his unearned executive titles, completely cutting off his access to the company bank accounts and terminating his lavish, company-funded lifestyle. Because the forensic audit proved that my parents had technically co-signed on several of Julian's fraudulent loan documents, they were held legally responsible for the massive remaining deficit. To cover the heavy damages and avoid a full criminal indictment for their golden boy, my parents were forced to liquidate their personal investments and put the family home up for sale, completely losing control of the entire estate to my legal representation. It was absolute, poetic justice. The very system they used to enable Julian had ultimately dismantled them. My parents and brother left the courthouse completely ruined, facing a bleak financial reality they couldn't escape, while I walked away with my financial security entirely intact. I immediately used my newly secured funds to buy a beautiful house in a quiet, safe neighborhood miles away from their toxicity, ensuring a bright, peaceful future for Violet. I blocked their remaining numbers and cut ties with them permanently. Standing up to decades of family gaslighting was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but seeing my daughter smile safely in our new home made every single courtroom battle worth it. Looking back at that exhausting courtroom battle, I finally realized that protecting my daughter gave me the absolute strength to shatter a lifetime of family gaslighting. For 34 years, I was conditioned to believe that keeping the peace meant sacrificing my own dignity and allowing a monster to run rampant. But true family doesn't demand your silence in exchange for their toxic comfort. And they certainly don't protect an abuser over an innocent 8-year-old child. By standing my ground and forcing Julian to face the legal consequences of his actions, I didn't just save Violet from their toxic cycle. I finally set myself free. Now that you've heard everything, I have to ask you honestly, what would you have done if you were cornered like I was? Would you have pulled the legal trigger on your own family to shield your child? Or would you have walked away, just to avoid the drama? I really want to read your perspectives, so please share your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, don't forget to mention the city or country you're tuning in from. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel across the world. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.